The sun rose over the Georgia plantation like a watchful eye that never blinked. Its light spilled across fields of cotton that stretched so far they seemed to swallow the horizon, row after row bending under the same heat, the same exhaustion, the same quiet despair. Morning was not a beginning here. It was a continuation of pain that had never paused long enough to be forgotten. The day started before the rooster's cry, before the dew lifted from the soil, before the body had fully recovered from the ache of yesterday. In the slave quarters, rough wooden huts leaned into one another as if sharing the burden of existing, their walls thin, their floors hard, their air thick with the smell of damp earth and human fatigue. This was where she lived, where her life unfolded in whispers and wounds that could never be spoken aloud. She woke each day to the sound of chains clinking softly as people shifted in their sleep, a sound so common it had become part of the silence itself. There were children here too, small bodies curled beside mothers whose arms were both shelter and prison. The children learned early not to cry too loud, not to ask questions, not to stare too long at white faces. Childhood, in this place, was a brief and fragile thing, easily crushed beneath the weight of obedience. She watched them with a hollow tenderness, knowing how quickly laughter could be beaten out of a soul. Every smile felt borrowed, every moment of peace stolen from a future that offered nothing in return. When the overseer's bell rang, it cut through the air like a blade. Bodies rose, stiff and reluctant, moving on memory more than strength. She wrapped a faded cloth around her head, hands trembling slightly as she tied it, her fingers scarred from years of work. The scars told stories no one asked to hear. Cuts from cotton hooks, burns from boiling pots, welts hidden beneath worn fabric. Her name was rarely spoken. When it was, it came sharp and short from the mouths of those who owned her time, her labor, her very breath. She had learned to answer quickly, eyes downcast, voice low. Survival depended on it. The walk to the fields was always quiet. Conversation invited trouble, and trouble never arrived alone. The ground was cool in the early hours, but everyone knew what was coming. By noon, the sun would press down mercilessly, turning sweat into a second skin, making every movement heavier than the last. She bent to the plants and began her work, fingers moving automatically, her mind drifting to places it was safer not to linger. Each sack filled felt like proof of obedience, a temporary shield against punishment. But no amount of obedience ever guaranteed safety. That was the cruelest lesson of all. The master's house stood apart from everything else, tall and white, surrounded by shade trees and wide porches. From the fields it looked almost peaceful, like a promise of comfort that was never meant for her. Inside that house lived children who laughed freely, who ran barefoot across polished floors, who cried without fear of consequence. She saw them sometimes when she was summoned to clean or cook, their faces flushed with health, their futures protected by the color of their skin. They barely noticed her, except when they needed something. To them, she was part of the house, like a chair or a door, useful, silent, replaceable. Her duties often pulled her inside, away from the fields and into the suffocating order of the master's world. The kitchen was always hot, heavy with the smell of meat and bread and spices she was rarely allowed to taste. She cooked meals she would never eat, wiped tables she would never sit at, served food to people who spoke of her as if she were not standing right there. She listened as the master discussed prices, land, politics, and punishment with the same careless tone, as if human lives were no more significant than livestock. His voice carried authority, backed by law and whip alike. Resistance, even in thought, felt dangerous. The mistress was quieter but no less powerful. Her cruelty was sharper for being polite, delivered through cold stares and calculated silence. A missing spoon, a stain left unseen, a perceived glance held too long. Any of it could turn into a reason for discipline. The mistress's displeasure often fell hardest on the women, especially those forced to work within the house, close enough to see how differently the world treated others. The contrast was a daily torment. Clean dresses hung in closets while she wore the same patched garment until it nearly fell apart. Soft beds waited upstairs while she slept on straw. Abundance surrounded her, yet starvation, of dignity, of safety, of hope, was constant. Fear lived in her body the way blood did, flowing through every thought and movement. It was in the way her shoulders stayed tense even at rest, in how she measured each word before letting it leave her mouth. Punishment could come without warning, without reason. She had seen strong men broken for defiance that barely existed, women whipped for rumors, children beaten for mistakes they did not understand. She had learned to keep her face still, her emotions buried deep, because any sign of anger or grief could be used against her. Silence became armor. Tea grew heavier with each passing year. At night, when the work was done and the darkness offered a thin veil of privacy, she allowed herself to feel. Exhaustion settled into her bones, but sleep did not always come easily. Memories rose uninvited, of loved ones sold away, of screams carried off by the wind, of promises whispered in desperation and broken by morning. She remembered a time before this plantation, before Georgia, before chains, though those memories were fading, worn thin by suffering. Still, she clung to them, because remembering was a form of resistance, however small. There were moments, rare and dangerous, when anger flickered beneath her fear. She would watch the master's children play and feel a confusing mix of emotions she dared not name. It was not hatred, not yet, but a sharp awareness of injustice so deep it made her chest ache. She wondered what it would feel like to live without being owned, to wake without dread, to exist without permission. Such thoughts were forbidden, but once planted, they refused to die. They sat quietly in the corners of her mind, growing roots in the dark. The plantation thrived on control. Every aspect of life was regulated, from when one ate to when one slept, from who one loved to whether one was allowed to keep a child. Families were formed and torn apart at the whim of profit. Love itself became a risk. She had learned not to attach too deeply, not to dream too boldly, because loss was inevitable. And yet, despite every thing, the human spirit persisted. Songs were hummed under breath, prayers whispered into the night, stories shared in fragments. These small acts kept something alive inside her, something the chains could not fully crush. As days blurred into years, the weight of survival pressed harder. Her body aged faster than time allowed, her hands rough, her back bent. But inside, something was changing. The fear that once ruled her completely was no longer alone. It shared space with exhaustion, with sorrow, with a growing sense that endurance itself had limits. She did not yet know what shape that realization would take, only that the life she lived was slowly grinding her down to something raw and dangerous. The plantation, with all its order and cruelty, was unknowingly nurturing a storm beneath its surface. This was the world she inhabited in 1853 Georgia, a world built on suffering, maintained by silence and justified by power. Every sunrise demanded obedience. Every sunset counted survival as a victory. She moved through her days unseen and unheard, carrying wounds no one cared to heal. But beneath the quiet, beneath the bowed head and careful steps, something waited. The chains were real, the fear undeniable, yet the human heart is not so easily contained. In the shadow of the master's house, under the blazing southern sun, a life was being shaped by cruelty. And the consequences of that cruelty had not yet come to light. Her life had taught her how to endure pain, but it had not taught her how to survive loss. That lesson came slowly, like a wound that refused to close, reopening each time she thought it had finally begun to heal. In the hidden spaces of the plantation, away from the master's eyes, she carried memories that weighed more than any sack of cotton. They were memories of love formed in secrecy, of bonds that were never protected by law or mercy, of hope that dared to exist even when everything warned against it. She had once believed that if she kept her head down, if she worked harder than anyone expected, if she obeyed quickly and completely, she might be allowed one small thing to call her own. That belief had taken shape in the form of a child. The pregnancy itself had been a season of terror, each day filled with the fear that her condition would anger the mistress or inconvenience the master. She worked through sickness and pain, hiding her discomfort, praying silently that the child would be allowed to live. When the baby finally came, born in the darkness of the slave quarters with the help of other women who knew the risks, she felt something unfamiliar bloom inside her chest. It was not just love, it was purpose. Holding her child for the first time felt like holding proof that she was still human. The baby's tiny fingers wrapped around hers with a strength that surprised her, as if clinging to life with a determination she herself had nearly lost. In those moments, she allowed herself to imagine a future measured not only in survival, but in meaning. She whispered promises she had no power to keep, promising protection, warmth, a life better than her own. She knew the danger of such promises, yet she could not stop herself. A mother's heart did not understand caution the way a slave's mind had learned to. For a brief time, the child was allowed to stay with her. She carried the baby on her back when possible, soothed cries with hushed songs passed down from women who had sung to their own children under similar skies. The songs spoke of rivers, of freedom, of a God who saw suffering even when men pretended not to. At night, when the world finally quieted, she pressed her cheek to the child's head and breathed in the scent of new life. Those nights were short, but they were everything. The plantation, however, did not tolerate attachments that interfered with productivity or control. The master noticed the way her movements slowed, the way her attention drifted. The mistress noticed the child, noticed the softness that had crept into her eyes. Softness in their world was a flaw. It was something to be corrected. One morning, without warning or explanation, she was told the child would no longer stay with her during the day. Another woman would watch the babies together, they said, as if that made the separation gentle. She nodded, because nodding was safer than pleading. The first separation felt like having a limb torn away. Her arms ached with emptiness, her body moving through its tasks, while her mind stayed with the child she could no longer see. She listened for cries that might be hers, her heart jumping at every distant sound. When she was allowed brief moments with the baby, she clung too tightly, knowing how easily even those moments could be taken. Fear became constant again, sharper now because it threatened not just her, but the one thing she loved more than herself. Then came the illness. It began quietly, with a fever that would not break. The child's skin burned beneath her touch, tiny breaths coming too fast, too shallow. She begged quietly for help, knowing better than to raise her voice. The mistress dismissed her fears, accusing her of exaggeration, of trying to avoid work. The plantation doctor came late, uninterested, his visit brief and careless. He said the child would either live or die, as if it were a matter of chance rather than neglect. She watched him leave with a calm fury building inside her, a fury she swallowed because expressing it would only make things worse. She stayed awake for nights that blurred into days, holding her child, singing softly, praying until her voice went hoarse. Other women tried to help, offering cool cloths, whispered encouragement, shared tears. They had all seen this before. They knew how it often ended. When the child finally grew still in her arms, the world seemed to tilt. For a moment, she did not understand what had happened. She shook the small body gently, whispering the child's name, begging for a response. When none came, a sound tore from her chest that she barely recognized as her own. Grief was not something the plantation allowed time for. The child was taken from her arms quickly, wrapped and carried away without ceremony. There was no grave she was allowed to visit, no marker to say that this life had existed. She was expected to return to work the next day, her tears treated as an inconvenience. When she moved too slowly, when her eyes remained unfocused, punishment followed. Pain became layered, physical blows landing on top of emotional devastation. Each strike seemed to say the same thing: your suffering does not matter. Something inside her cracked then, not loudly, but deeply. The part of her that believed endurance would be rewarded began to die. She continued to work, continued to obey, but it was different now. The world had taken the one thing she had allowed herself to love without restraint. The emptiness that followed was not quiet. It pressed against her ribs, made breathing feel like effort. At night, she dreamed of the child crying, reaching for her, disappearing again and again no matter how fast she ran. Loss did not come to her only once. Over the years, she saw other women endure the same fate: children sold, children beaten, children buried. Each time the pain felt personal, reopening her own wound. She began to understand that what had been done to her was not an accident or a tragedy of circumstance. It was part of a system that thrived on breaking bonds, on teaching people that love was a liability. That understanding changed her grief into something heavier, something more dangerous. Abuse continued, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt. Words meant to humiliate, hands that lingered too long, punishments delivered with cold efficiency. Each violation stripped away another layer of trust in the world. She learned that there was no protection, no justice waiting quietly in the background. The law belonged to those who owned her. God, if he was listening, remained silent. The prayers she once whispered with hope began to sound different, edged with desperation and confusion. She started to withdraw from others, afraid that forming new attachments would only lead to more pain. The women around her noticed the change, the way she spoke less, the way her eyes seemed to look through people rather than at them. They tried to reach her, offering comfort, but grief had built walls inside her that kindness struggled to cross. It was easier to be alone with her thoughts than to risk caring again. Isolation became both refuge and prison. Yet even in isolation, memories haunted her. She remembered the warmth of the child's body, the weight of that small life against her chest. She remembered the promises she had made, promises she felt she had failed to keep. Guilt joined grief, whispering cruel questions late at night. What if she had worked less? What if she had begged louder? What if she had tried to run? These questions had no answers, only the power to deepen her pain. The plantation continued as if nothing had happened. Seasons changed, crops rotated, children of the master grew taller and louder. Their laughter felt like an insult she could not escape. Each sound reminded her of what had been stolen. She watched them with a numb detachment, aware of the vast difference between their protected lives and the fragile existence her own child had been denied. That awareness settled into her bones, shaping the way she saw everything that followed. Grief, left unacknowledged and unhealed, does not fade. It transforms. In her, it hardened into something cold and sharp. She stopped believing in fairness, stopped expecting mercy. The world, as she now understood it, was ruled by power alone. Those who had it took what they wanted. Those who did not suffered quietly or died. This understanding did not bring peace, but it brought clarity. The illusion of safety was gone. Deep inside, beneath layers of fear and sorrow, a question began to form. It was not yet a plan, not yet even a thought she could fully articulate. It was simply a sense that enduring endlessly was no longer the same as living. She did not know what the future held, only that the path she was on led nowhere but deeper pain. The loss of her child had carved a hollow space inside her, and in that hollow space, something new was beginning to grow, something born not of hope, but of unbearable grief and the slow realization a heart pushed too far does not break quietly forever. After the loss, time did not heal her. It only stretched the pain thinner, spreading it across every hour of every day, until it touched everything she did. The plantation returned to its routines with brutal efficiency, as if grief were a weakness to be corrected, rather than a wound to be tended. She learned quickly that sorrow, like love, was something she was expected to hide. Tears earned suspicion, silence earned survival. So she became quiet in a way she had never been before, not the careful silence of obedience, but a deeper one, where thoughts stayed locked behind her eyes and emotions hardened into something unrecognizable. Her body kept working, but her spirit moved elsewhere. She bent over cotton rows with the same rhythm as before, yet something inside her had shifted out of alignment. The world no longer felt merely cruel, it felt deliberate. Each command, each punishment, each careless laugh from the master's house seemed arranged to remind her that suffering here was not an accident. It was a design. Understanding this did not free her, but it stripped away the last traces of illusion that endurance alone might earn mercy. She began to notice things she had once forced herself not to see. The way the overseer enjoyed lingering just long enough to watch fear settle into someone's face. The way the mistress's eyes hardened when kindness appeared between the enslaved women. The way children were used as leverage, rewarded, threatened, separated, to ensure obedience. These patterns had always existed, but now they stood out sharply, like scars on exposed skin. Knowledge, she realized, could be as painful as ignorance, but it could also be dangerous in a different way. At night, when others slept, she stayed awake, staring into the darkness of the cabin. Thoughts moved through her mind with a persistence that refused rest. She replayed moments from her life, searching for points where things might have been different, then dismissing them one by one. The truth was unbearable in its simplicity. Nothing she had done would have changed what happened. The system she lived under was built to consume people like her. That realization burned away the guilt she had carried and replaced it with something colder, steadier. She stopped praying the way she once had. The whispered pleas for protection and mercy felt empty now, words thrown into a silence that never answered. Instead, her thoughts turned inward. She began to ask herself questions she had never dared to ask before. What was obedience worth, if it did not protect the innocent? What was survival, if it required the constant swallowing of injustice? These questions did not lead her toward peace, but they sharpened her awareness. She felt herself standing at the edge of something, though she did not yet know its shape. Her interactions with others changed subtly. She still spoke when spoken to, still followed orders, but her eyes no longer carried the same softness. Other women noticed and grew cautious. Some mistook her distance for strength, others for danger. She did not correct them. Isolation suited her now. It gave her space to think, to observe, to feel without interruption. In that isolation, anger began to surface. Not the explosive anger that led to punishment, but a quiet, controlled fury that settled deep in her chest. She watched the master's family more closely than before, not with envy but with a strange detachment, as if studying a different species. She noticed how their comfort was maintained by suffering they never acknowledged, how their children were shielded from consequences that fell mercilessly on others. She noticed how easily violence could be justified when it protected privilege. These observations did not come with immediate conclusions. They simply accumulated, forming a heavy weight of understanding she carried everywhere. Memory became both weapon and wound. She remembered her child's face, the warmth, the helplessness. That memory returned often, uninvited, striking with the force of fresh grief. But alongside the pain it carried clarity. Love had made her vulnerable, yes, but it had also shown her what had been stolen. The system that allowed her child to die without consequence was the same system that demanded her obedience. This connection settled into her mind with a permanence that frightened her. Fear, once her constant companion, began to lose its sharps edge. It did not disappear. She still knew the cost of defiance, but it no longer ruled her completely. She had already lost what mattered most to her. That loss changed the balance. Punishment threatened her body, but her soul felt already scarred beyond what a whip could accomplish. This did not make her reckless, but it made her less pliable. Fear could no longer command her thoughts the way it once had. She started to recognize similar changes in others. Though few spoke of them openly, there were glances exchanged, pauses in conversation, moments of shared understanding that passed without words. Suffering had shaped them all differently. Some grew smaller beneath its weight, others harder. She saw both outcomes and wondered which path she was walking. She did not yet see herself as someone capable of action. She still thought of herself as someone enduring. But endurance, she was learning, could transform into something else if pushed far enough. The nights grew longer in her mind. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams that left her breathless. In those dreams, she stood at the center of a storm, unable to move, watching destruction unfold around her. She woke with her heart racing, hands clenched, a sense of inevitability pressing down on her. The dreams frightened her, not because of what they showed, but because of how they made her feel. Awake, alert, alive in a way she had not felt since before her loss. She began to question the meaning of morality in a whirl. Like hers. Right and wrong, as defined by those in power, served only to maintain control. Laws protected the master, not justice. Punishment was arbitrary, mercy rare. If morality was a weapon used against her, then what obligation did she have to honor it? This thought unsettled her, even as it took root. She had been raised to believe in goodness, in restraint, in the value of human life. Those beliefs did not vanish, but they twisted under the pressure of reality. Small moments fed the change within her. A child beaten for a mistake. A woman sold away without farewell. A man punished for speaking too slowly. Each incident added another layer to the structure forming inside her, a structure built from grief, anger, and clarity. She did not talk about these moments, but she remembered them with precision. Memory, she realized, was a form of power, even if it offered no immediate escape. The plantation itself seemed to sense the tension building beneath its routines. Discipline grew harsher, surveillance tighter. The overseer watched faces more closely, as if expecting something to break through the surface. She responded by becoming more controlled, more careful. Outwardly, she appeared unchanged. Inwardly, she was gathering herself, though she could not yet name what she was preparing for. The gap between her inner world and outer behavior widened, creating a dangerous duality. There were times she wondered if she was losing herself, if the person she was becoming someone she no longer recognized. That fear lingered, especially when she felt a flicker of satisfaction at the thought of defiance, however abstract. She clung to memories of who she had been, a mother, a woman capable of tenderness, to remind herself that she was still human. But humanity, she was learning, could coexist with darkness when circumstances demanded it. The system had taught her that her life was expendable. Her grief taught her that her love had been wasted by that system. Between those lessons, a new understanding formed. Nothing would change unless something disrupted the balance of fear and control. This understanding did not come with a plan or intention, only a shift in perception. The world no longer appeared fixed, it appeared fragile, held together by compliance and silence. And silence, she knew intimately, could be broken. As days passed, the seed planted by loss continued to grow. It did not yet resemble action. It was more like pressure, building slowly, invisibly, against the walls of her endurance. She still moved through her days as expected, still bowed her head, still answered when called. But beneath that surface, the question persisted, growing louder with each injustice she witnessed. How much could a human soul be forced to carry before it pushed back? Not out of hope, but out of necessity. She did not know the answer yet. She only knew that something within her had crossed a line it could not uncross. The woman who had believed in survival through obedience was gone. In her place stood someone shaped by grief, sharpened by awareness, and haunted by a loss that refused to fade. The plantation remained unchanged, but she was not. And change, once begun, rarely stayed contained. The night arrived without warning, ordinary in every way that mattered to those who believed the world they controlled would remain obedient forever. The air was heavy, pressing down on the plantation with the same weight that had ruled it for generations. Crickets sang, unaware of human suffering, and the distant lowing of animals carried across the fields. Inside the slave quarters, bodies lay exhausted, surrendering briefly to sleep before another day of labor. She lay awake, as she often did now, her eyes fixed on the darkness above her, her mind restless and painfully clear. There was no sudden madness, no single spark that ignited what followed. What happened that night was the result of years of cruelty layered upon loss, of silence enforced by fear, of humanity denied so completely that something inside her had been pushed beyond endurance. She did not feel wild or out of control. If anything, she felt calm in a way that frightened her. Calm born not of peace but of finality. The questions that had haunted her no longer circled endlessly. They had settled into a single, terrible certainty. The world she lived in would never stop harming the innocent unless it was forced to confront consequences it believed could neave. Reach it. She moved quietly, each step measured, aware of how sound traveled in the night. The plantation slept in confidence, guarded more by arrogance than vigilance. This was a place that believed itself untouchable, protected by law, by custom, by the belief that the enslaved were incapable of action beyond obedience. That belief had shaped every cruelty inflicted here. It was also the weakness no one saw. As she passed familiar paths, memories rose unbidden, faces of women bent by labor, of men broken by punishment, of children whose lives ended before they were allowed to begin. Each memory pressed against her chest, threatening to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to keep moving. Stopping now would mean returning to the life that had already destroyed her. Forward, however terrible, was the only direction left. The master's house loomed pale against the night sky, its windows dark, its doors closed in comfort. Inside slept a family untouched by the suffering that sustained their wealth. She had served in that house, had carried food to its tables, had cleaned its floors while listening to laughter echo above her head. The contrast between that comfort and the misery surrounding it had long been unbearable. Tonight it felt obscene. Her thoughts did not dwell on innocence or guilt in the way the world defined them. Those definitions had never protected her child, had never spared anyone she loved. Instead, her mind returned again and again to the system itself, to the idea that power survived because it never believed it could be challenged. What she was about to do was not an attempt to escape. It was not hope for survival. It was a collision, deliberate and irreversible, between that belief and reality. Everything happened quickly, yet time seemed distorted, stretching and compressing in strange ways. Sounds felt too loud, then too distant. Her heart pounded, but her hands did not shake. She moved with a focus she did not recognize as her own, guided by something deeper than thought. When the moment came, there was no triumph, no release, only a heavy, crushing awareness that once crossed, this line could never be erased. The act itself was chaotic, marked by confusion and panic that shattered the night's false calm. Screams tore through the darkness, followed by shouts, footsteps, the sudden eruption of fear in a place that had always assumed fear belonged only to others. She did not linger. There was nothing to linger for. The consequences were already unfolding, rippling outward faster than she could follow. The plantation, so confident in its control, was awake now, thrown into disorder by the unimaginable. As alarms spread and people poured from their quarters, she retreated into the shadows, her mind racing but strangely detached. The world felt unreal, as if she were watching events from a distance, faces blurred, voices overlapped, and the night filled with confusion and terror. The master's authority, once so absolute, cracked under the weight of chaos. Orders were shouted, but no one seemed certain what to do. Fear, usually so carefully directed, had escaped its boundaries. She did not run far. There was nowhere to run that would change what had already been done. Instead, she waited, hidden but present, listening as the plantation struggled to understand what had happened. Speculation turned quickly into accusation, suspicions spreading like fire. The idea that an enslaved woman could commit such an act was almost as shocking as the act itself. It threatened the foundation of everything they believed about control, obedience, and hierarchy. As dawn approached, the weight of reality settled fully onto her shoulders. The calm that had guided her began to fracture, replaced by a surge of emotions too complex to name. Grief returned, sharp and raw, joined by horror and an overwhelming sense of inevitability. She did not tell herself she had done the right thing. She did not seek comfort in justification. She understood only that something inside her had broken, and in breaking, had shattered the illusion that this world was stable or just. She thought of her child then, more vividly than she had in years. Not as a symbol or a reason, but as a small, fragile life that had been lost without consequence. The memory cut deeply, reopening wounds she knew would never heal. Whatever judgment awaited her, it could not take more from her than had already been taken. That knowledge settled into her ones with a cold certainty. When she was finally found, there was no resistance. She did not fight or plead. Her strength had been spent long before this night. Hands grabbed her, voices shouted accusations, but she remained silent, her eyes distant. Those who looked at her expected madness, remorse, or defiance. What they saw instead unsettled them more. A woman emptied of fear, standing at the center of something no one knew how to contain. The plantation tried to restore order quickly, to frame the night as an isolated horror rather than a reflection of its own brutality. But the damage was already done. The sense of invincibility that had protected them was gone. Whispers spread, not just among the enslaved but among the masters as well. If this could happen here, what else was possible? That question lingered, unspoken but powerful. As she was dragged away, the sounds of the plantation resumed in a fractured way. Commands given, work slowly restarting, life attempting to return to normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. The night had exposed something everyone preferred to ignore, That suffering, when pushed far enough, does not disappear. It transforms, it erupts. Inside her, emotions collided violently. Horror at what had occurred mixed with a grim awareness that there had been no other path left open to her. She did not feel absolved. She felt condemned by the world, by her own memories, by the knowledge that violence, once unleashed, leaves nothing untouched. Yet, even in that condemnation, there was a bitter clarity. The system that had crushed her life had finally been forced to feel fear. The sun rose over the plantation as it always had, casting light on fields and buildings unchanged in appearance. But beneath that familiar surface, something fundamental had shifted. The night of blood and fire had burned away the illusion of absolute control. Whether the world would learn from that truth or bury it beneath punishment and denial remained to be seen. She knew only that the storm she carried inside had finally broken, and the echoes of that breaking would not fade easily, no matter how desperately those in power tried to silence them. Morning did not bring clarity. It brought judgment. As the sun climbed over the plantation, light fell on a place struggling to pretend that order still existed. The routines resumed because they had to, because routine was the only language power knew when it wanted to erase disruption. But the night had left a scar that could not be scrubbed away. People spoke in hushed tones, glancing over shoulders, measuring every word. Fear had changed sides, if only slightly, and that frightened everyone. She was held apart from the others, bound not just by rope but by certainty. There would be no mercy, no trial shaped by fairness, no space for explanation. The law was already written, and it had never been meant to protect her. Those who gathered to judge her did not seek understanding. They sought restorati, on of authority. What she had done was not only a crime in their eyes, it was a challenge. It suggested that the boundaries they enforced were not as solid as they believed. That suggestion had to be crushed. They questioned her, but not to hear her answers. Their words were accusations, disguised as inquiries, each one reinforcing the story they needed to tell themselves. She listened without interruption, her silence mistaken for emptiness. In truth, she was full of memories, of sorrow, of a fatigue deeper than sleep. When they demanded she speak, she searched for words and found none that mattered. No sentence could explain a life shaped by loss. No confession could restore what had been taken from her. So she remained quiet, not in defiance, but in recognition of the futility of speech. Punishment was decided quickly. It always was. Delay would suggest doubt, and doubt was dangerous. As the decision was announced, she felt a curious detachment, as if the words were meant for someone else. Fear flickered briefly, a reflex honed by years of survival, but it did not take hold. She had lived too long with the expectation of pain to be surprised by it. What surprised her instead was the weight of everything she had not said, everything she had never been allowed to mourn aloud. The enslaved community reacted in fragments, glances exchanged, hands clenched, breaths held. No one dared speak openly, but grief and terror moved through them like a current. Some felt horror at what had occurred, others a grim understanding, many both at once. They knew what the punishment would mean, not just for her, but for all of them. Retaliation often spread wider than its target. Discipline tightened. Surveillance increased. The system responded the only way it knew how, by pressing harder. As days passed, she was moved, isolated further, her world reduced to a narrow space and the echo of her own thoughts. In that confinement, guilt found her, not the guilt others wanted her to feel, but a complicated, relentless one that circled endlessly. It whispered of lines crossed, of lives ended, of a future that could never be undone. It did not excuse her actions, but neither did it condemn her simply. It asked questions without answers and offered no rest. She thought often of her child, not as justification, but as a presence that refused to fade. The memory of that small life remained the sharpest pain she carried. She wondered what kind of mother she had been, what kind of woman she had become. She wondered if love, once twisted by suffering, could survive in any recognizable form. These thoughts did not bring peace. They brought honesty, and honesty was heavy. Sometimes, in the quiet, she imagined another path. A world where help had come in time, where mercy had existed, where endurance had been enough. These imaginings were cruel in their own way, because they highlighted how far from reality such possibilities were. The past did not bend to longing. It stood fixed, unchangeable, demanding to be faced. She faced it without flinching, because there was no longer any benefit in turning away. Those who guarded her watched closely, expecting signs of madness or collapse. They whispered about her when they thought she could not hear. Some were uneasy, unsettled by her calm. Others felt satisfaction, believing order had been restored. None of them truly understood what lingered in the aftermath of such violence. They saw only the surface, a crime punished, authority reaffirmed. Beneath that surface, something else persisted, a question that refused to die. What had driven a person to such an end? That question haunted them even as they tried to bury it. The plantation carried on, but its rhythm felt altered. Laughter in the master's house sounded forced, brittle. The overseer's confidence sharpened into cruelty, as if he could beat uncertainty back into submission. Among the enslaved, silence deepened, heavy and watchful. The lesson was clear, yet incomplete. Fear returned, but it was no longer pure. It was mixed with awareness. Awareness, once awakened, does not sleep easily. In her final days, she reflected on justice, not as the woe. RLD defined it, but as something more elusive. She did not believe what she had done would bring fairness or freedom. She was not naive enough for that. But she also rejected the idea that the suffering she had endured was meaningless. Even if the system crushed her completely, it could not erase the truth of what had been revealed, that oppression depended on obedience, and obedience had limits. She did not ask for forgiveness from those who judged her. Their forgiveness had never been hers to receive. Instead, she turned inward, grappling with her own humanity. Could a person commit an unforgivable act and still remain human? The question haunted her, not because she sought absolution, but because she feared becoming only what others said she was. In remembering her capacity for love, for grief, for reflection, she held on to the last pieces of herself that violence had not consumed. When the end came, it was public, deliberate, meant to instruct. She stood beneath the weight of countless eyes, some filled with fear, some with anger, some with something close to sorrow. She did not struggle. She did not cry out. Her stillness unsettled those who expected spectacle. In that stillness was everything she had learned, that dignity could exist even where mercy did not, that silence could speak when words were denied. The punishment ended her life, but it did not close the story. Stories like hers did not end neatly. They lingered in memory, passed in whispers, reshaped by fear and time. Among the enslaved, her name was spoken carefully, sometimes with horror, sometimes with a quiet understanding. She became a warning and a symbol at once, of the cost of defiance and of the cost of endurance pushed beyond its limit. For those in power, the event became something to forget, a stain to be covered by routine and authority. Official accounts reduced it to an act of madness, a singular evil disconnected from the world that had produced it. That narrative was comforting because it protected them from responsibility. But comfort built on denial is fragile. Beneath it, the truth waited patiently. Years later, the plantation would look much the same to an outsider, fields stretching wide, buildings standing firm, labor continuing as it always had. But beneath that appearance, the echoes of what happened in 1853 remained. They lived in tightened rules, in wary glances, in the unspoken knowledge that suffering, when ignored, does not disappear. It transforms, and sometimes it explodes. Her life, reduced by others to a single night of violence, had been far more than that. It had been a long journey through love, loss, obedience, and awakening. It had been shaped by choices constrained by cruelty and fear. Judgment had come swiftly, as it always did for someone like her, but understanding never followed. Perhaps it never would. In the end, what remained was not a simple lesson or a moral easily stated. What remained was a question that refused to fade with time. When a system is built on dehumanization, who bears responsibility for the horrors that emerge from it? The world answered that question by punishing her and moving on. History, quieter and more patient, continued to ask it. And somewhere beyond judgment and guilt, beyond punishment and denial, her story endured, not as an excuse for violence, but as a testament to what happens when humanity is stripped away piece by piece. It stood as a reminder that chains do not only bind bodies, they bind consciences, until one breaks.